My name is Eric Kinsey. I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana, and you're listening to Rulers and Riders, the podcast where we talk to creative people about what they do and sometimes about what they ride. This episode will be the last interview for this season, and it's a good one. This week our guest is John Howie Jr. John is a singer-songwriter based in North Carolina and has been playing music professionally since the early 90s. You may know him from his songwriting work with the $2 Pistols and the Rosewood Bluff, as well as a former drummer for Sarah Shook and the Disarmers. Recently, he released a critically acclaimed record, Not Tonight, under his own name. It was a real pleasure to talk to John. Our conversation got into his upbringing in the South, his early days as a punk rock drummer, the transition to country singer-songwriter, being a dad, as well as all the ups and downs in between. There's some inexplicable background noise that I think may be due to a defective microphone. I apologize for that, but it does not distract from the quality of the conversation. It's a great talk, and I think you'll dig it. Let's talk to John. So, man, it's like really cool to finally get to talk to you in person or over the phone, I guess. our I don't know, year or years of direct message conversations have always been really cool. And man, it's cool because I knew your music first, and I really dug that, and to become friends with you is it's been really cool. I genuinely enjoy our conversations.
Me too. Likewise, for sure, man. For sure, absolutely.
Thanks, buddy. But it's funny, man, because for being someone that I think if I had not got to know you, for being someone that I always thought of as a very kind of hardcore country singer songwriter. Your musical taste is not only as all over the place as mine is, but it's great, dude. I'm actually very impressed because most people are sort of I'm this or I'm that, but you're
sure.
Definitely a lover of music, and I totally appreciate that.
Yes.
So how did you? So you're John Howie Jr. So what was your dad like?
He was kind of a force of nature, man. He was sort of when I think of someone from the South, he sort of, this is going to sound weird, but to me kind of embodied kind of the best parts of what I think of when I think of Southern people. In other words, he approached every situation kind of differently. He loved country music. He loved especially once that outlaw thing hit, Waylon and Willie and all that stuff. He loved all that. That movement. If you and I were sitting in a room and he was still alive and he walked in, you would immediately think, well, that's what that guy listens to. It was tailor made for him because it was kind of edgy. And talked about things relationships, but also about, getting older. And those guys had a tenderness and a sensitivity to them that he was, comfortable enough to be perfectly okay with. He rode motorcycles a lot. He rode Harley Davidsons. When I was a kid, he had an Indian that he'd had for a while and decided to get rid of it, I think, because I have a sister who's 3 years older than me. And I think just kind of thought, I need to not do that because it's, it's a little more dangerous. And so, but when we got into high school, he picked it back up. And towards the end of his life, he was very passionate about that. But, you know, he liked like Howlin' Wolf and stuff like that too. He was from Tupelo, Mississippi. That's where he was born, and his father, my grandfather, was a Presbyterian minister. You know, so there was that, and they moved around a lot when he was growing up. They moved to Memphis from Tupelo, just like the Presleys did, and then eventually Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Fayetteville, and probably another couple places in there that I'm forgetting. This is going back a ways, obviously. But so, you know, so he was not particularly into religion because he'd spent his whole life with it, and was just not really into. You know, he thought things like church were just kind of restrictive. So he wasn't really into that. But, you know, he was just a cool guy, man. We didn't get along that well when I was a teenager because he had grown up, you know, really poor and had worked his way through, you know, college and gotten scholarships and stuff like that, and couldn't really understand why I didn't, you know, want to focus on, you know, studies and things like that, and go from point A to point B, get that degree, and then go get that job. You know, I think that was a little tricky for him to understand until I started opening up for like Billy Joe Shaver and Merle Haggard. Now, once that stuff started happening, he was fine. You know, he was fine with it. You know, I mean, like a lot of people from his generation, I think, you know, he kind of needed to see results, and it's not that he wasn't supportive or was particularly critical of it. You know, I think he just thought that it was something I should do on the side, you know, that whole have something to fall back on, which is not bad advice, you know, but, so when we opened up for Haggard in 98, we opened up for Billy Joe Shaver, I think that was probably 99, and Billy Joe, and I'm sure he does this to everyone, but after, we played, and then Allison Mortar played, and then Billy Joe Shaver. It was like a 3-act bill. Right. And while Allison Mortar was playing, I was talking to my dad, and Billy Joe came over and spoke to him and was very complimentary about our band and my songwriting in particular. And you know, I mean, my dad loved that Honky Tonk Heroes record, and he had, great. You know, he had at least one of those older Billy Joe Shaver records. And so, you know, when things like that happen, it sort of validated things for him. And I can understand that, you know. So, by the time he died, we were on fantastic terms, and it was pretty tragic, because I was 33. He died in 2002. You Ruined Everything by the $2 Pistols was like a month away from coming out when he died.
Oh, man.
So, yeah, so it was hard, man, you know, but we had a really good relationship, and a good model for, you know, I mean, you're a parent. Yep. It's nice to have a good model for that. I mean, I have friends who did not, and I think it's a little bit more of a struggle for them. I'm not the best dad in the world, but when I get off track a little bit, I can think, well, what would my dad have done here that would have helped me, you know? And he was, you know, he could be kind of a hard ass, but you know, but he was also very, very caring, and I never doubted that, you know. So I've kind of tried to do that with my own son, just make sure that he always knows that I love him, you know, because I think that, you know how it is. I mean, if you have that foundation, I think people can get through a lot, you know.
Right. Yeah, I've described my own dad as a Southern style hard ass.
Right.
And people who, you know, in Indiana, obviously not in the South, but like people, Indiana, like my family is like all from the South, right, and have very, you know, Southern upbringing. I prefer the South. I like the Midwest fine, but like,
sure,
I prefer, you know, the South. And people, there's like a certain, like, I don't know, like definitely like a very like Christian work ethic and
Right.
like a certain sense of expectations and a certain sense of like, you know, propriety on one hand, but like also sort of like a I don't know, almost like a hell-raising resistance to authority on the other hand.
There is that for sure. Yeah. There is no question about that. I mean, I think my dad determined. He was in the Air Force, and I think he thought that kind of helped him, because my understanding is that he was kind of a screw up, and my grandfather figured out some way to have him sent off to some kind of military school, maybe got him in through some kind of religious, you know, church program. I don't know, but
Right.
and I think that turned him around. It's impossible for me to imagine my dad being a screw up, but that is my understanding.
Right.
That's the way he was, and so I think doing that and being in the Air Force taught him, you know, two things. One, you know, kind of how to, you know, work within a set of rules and take better care of himself and understand things. But I think it also taught him that he did not want anybody to be his boss. So he worked really, 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 really hard. And by the time he died, he, you know, there's always somebody above you, but he was running, he got really into substance abuse treatment in the 70s. And, you know, in the 70s, you know, where I grew up at least, that wasn't a thing. I mean, people were drunk driving and everything all the time. But by the 80s, people started getting into, you know, that, and seeking help when they needed it, and not, you know, there wasn't kind of a stigma about that, and he was the guy, you know. So
Yeah.
There's a building named after him at the Wake County Alcoholism Treatment Center to this day. You know, he was the chief of staff there when he died. I mean, he was 68. He was showing no signs of retiring. But so that sort of anti-authority thing, I think that you're talking about, you know, and it certainly kind of bit him in the ass, you know, when I was 16, and, you know, and into punk rock and all that. There's no question, you know, but you know, I was only so upset he could get about it, because I, you know, I learned it from, you know, by example. So
Yeah, man, my dad just did not know what to think of me, you know, like, especially in high school, like 15, 16, 17, he just, oh man, I remember that I had this girlfriend who was a little bit older than me, was like 2 years older than me, so I was a junior in high school, and she was a freshman in college, and she's like, I think it'd be real sexy if you went and got your ear pierced.
Okay.
I was like, okay, because I was like, really like this girl. So we go to the mall. We actually go to like Claire's, you know, in the mall, the ear piercing place with the little gun. Get my ear pierced, and for like a week, I was able to keep my left side away from my dad, like he never saw it. Well, then one day we had to go somewhere. He wanted me to go help him with something at work, and I get in this truck, and I'm just like sitting there, and he's in the driver's seat, and I'm on the passenger side, and I'm just like, man, like we made it to the end of the street, and he's like, what the hell's in your ear? And I was like, oh, I got my ear pierced. And he was just so mad. He's like, take it out. I was like, I won't. I don't know. And then you know, the hair and the clothes and all of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But you know, it's strange. I think a lot of, you know, in popular conception of like history, a lot of people think like, oh, the baby boomer generation, they were all hippies and they were all wild, and I'm like, no, man, they were all like the Socs and the outsiders. They were all like the Madras shirts and the loafers with no shoes, and, you know, white Levi's kind of people. And
for sure, yeah. We had sort of a weird deal at my house, because my uncle, my father's brother, had been in the Korean War, and basically, you know, was a hyper intelligent guy who joined the army kind of to learn about electronics and stuff, you know, not knowing we were going to go to war with fucking China. And so he got dunked in the middle of that, and I'm not sure they had the term PTSD in 1978, 79, or if they did, it certainly wasn't common. And so he, by that point, the way things were, because he had been in the war so long before this time or whatever, for some reason he was, some bureaucratic bullshit, he was no longer eligible for kind of VA benefits, and he was basically homeless. And so we drove to Knoxville, Tennessee one day when I couldn't have been older than 8. I think 1977, my dad came in my room and said, "We're going to have to get your uncle. He's being thrown out of his, basically his tenement. He doesn't have any money, so we're going to have to drive to Knoxville and get him." And so we did, and he lived with us the rest of his life. My father kind of took care of him. He had a job. He worked as a security guard at night at like a State Farm insurance building or something, sometime when he didn't have to be around people. But he was the most misanthropic human being I have ever met in my life. It was unreal. It was just like that experience, he just hated humanity after that. And but so that was kind of an odd, I didn't know many people who had relatives who lived with them because they had trouble functioning in society because they'd seen combat. I'm sure that those people were out there, but I didn't know anybody, who was dealing with that. So,
right.
But I respected him, taking care of his family for sure.
It's very possible too that like not being eligible for the VA may have saved him because, just the way they treat veterans now. There's so much over medication and
I'm sure
they just kind of
get them in, get them out. Right.
Give them a prescription to kind of keep them calm down.
Right.
So that's the thing about that generation too. It's like those that saw combat, those that actually went overseas. That was a pretty hard way to go, man.
Dude.
Yeah.
I never actually heard any stories because my uncle, like I say, man, he loved my sister. Mm-hmm. He loved my mom. He was very fond of women and just in general. And he loved animals. He loved dogs. He loved cats. But men, I think he'd had enough of that. You know what I mean? I think he'd seen just about enough of the male of the species as he ever wanted to see. But he would occasionally have some beers with my dad and tell him, just fucking horror stories about men and women being used as shields by the North Koreans and things like that. And it just sounded, it was awful. The kind of stuff that, traumatizes you, obviously.
Yeah. I did, it's a long story, but I was thinking the other day about where does punk rock come from? Like what are the origins of punk? And not just so much like, this band was first or that band was first or this city had the first punk band. Really, and this is my kind of pet theory. I would bounce it off of you based on this program or this conversation. I think rock and roll changed after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay.
With
that's interesting.
Yeah, and that the nihilism of the threat of nuclear war became like a driving factor, not just in rock and roll and culture in general, but that's when you really start to get like all of that, like especially like the harder edged American like garage rock and roll, like the 64, 65, 66. You start to get all that great Fort Worth stuff and like the beginnings of like garage rock in LA and Detroit and
sure,
and
the Seeds,
yeah,
things like that for sure, no doubt.
And so I've just kind of developed this theory that like punk rock is like, so you have like peace and love, you have the hippies, you have that like the psychedelic escapism and the denial of the threat of nuclear war.
Sure. Yeah.
And then you have like the embrace of it of the nihilism, and that's where like punk rock, really kind of grew in the next 10, 12 years after that, as all those kids came of age, and I don't know. That's my working theory.
That's really interesting. Yeah, no, I can see that for sure. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it certainly doesn't seem like, like guys like that, like Sky Saxon, or even a couple years later, like the Stooges or whoever. It's not like those guys were thinking that they were going to be 70. It doesn't seem, it's not like they weren't really acting like they were shooting for longevity. I'm always kind of amazed that someone like Iggy, or even that Ron Ashton lived as long as he did. Like that to me is just crazy, considering what those guys, the way those guys were at that time. Like something like Wayne Kramer, for example. It seems like he tried about as hard as he could to kill himself without actually doing it. It's kind of remarkable. But then most of his band's dead and has so that theory makes as much sense to me as anybody else, as any other theory. Were you into that kind of Nuggets sort of stuff? Did you ever go through that deal?
I'm still in it, dude.
yeah, sure. It's really fun stuff. Yeah, no, absolutely. I like that guy, Sean Bonnewell, the Music Machine. I like that guy a lot.
Yeah.
I'm really into that guy's music. And it's just such a freak with his one black glove, and like his band all wore black, and that's heavy stuff for 1966, man.
It's fantastic. So my son Utah, he's like 24, soon to be 25.
Okay.
And it's real funny how so there was like the Hard Times, like that parody, like
oh sure, yeah, I love that thing. Yeah.
There's that one really funny picture where it's like a child of rockabilly couple has no idea what the fuck is going on, and like my son's like that. He's like, yeah, I just thought everybody listened to Billy Childish and freak beat music and like rockabilly and the Cramps, and I just thought that's what dads listen to. He's like, I never realized that until I got into high school, and it was like, what, your dad doesn't have all the Kinks reissues? Like, what's wrong with your dad?
I've often wondered about, and it's weird the way that works. So I'm tell you the story just very briefly. My father, when he and my mother, we and my sister, and my uncle, we all moved out to the country. We were living in this sort of lower middle class, upper lower class neighborhood that's now worth $1 gazillion every home there, but at the time it wasn't. And he got kind of tired of it. And when he had gotten out of the Air Force, he went to some friend of his that had money and said, well, I have this little bit of money from this. What should I do with it? And his friend said, what they financial advisors, always say, they say about land, they're not making any more of it. So he goes and buys some land out in the middle of nowhere. On the edge of Wake County, which is where Raleigh is, the edge of that county with another county called Durham County, which is where a city called Durham is, right? So he bought several acres out there. There's nothing out there. It was virtually worthless land, and he ended up moving us out there in 1979, I believe, and we lived in a trailer while he and my mom built this house with a friend of theirs who was they were tight with, who was a contractor. But this guy had been a roadie for the Allman Brothers at one point. Wow. Okay, so one day Waylon's coming through town, and then again, this is like 79 or 80, so he's still, he's still kind of in his prime. I mean, not key, but he's still huge, in other words. And I had to go to the dentist that day. And my mom said, just want to let you know, some of Waylon Jennings' band is going to come by the house tonight. Our friend Jed is going to bring them by, and just want to let you know, like, when you get home from the dentist, which is crazy, So I'm at the dentist. I know it was just bananas, but so I was at the dentist, and I said, this is this crazy thing's happening. Waylon Jennings' band is coming by our house. And Dennis had no idea who Waylon Jennings was. And to me, that was just like, are you kidding? That's like not knowing who the president, in my house, this guy's like a hero. The thing that ended up being really cool, and you'll appreciate this, because I still have the business cards, because my mom wrote on the back of them, Sonny Curtis and Jerry Allison were the people who came by the house, because the Crickets were the opening act on this tour. So it wasn't like Ralph Mooney came by, but Sonny Curtis and Jerry Allison came to our house, and I still have each one of them had a business card they gave my mom, and my mom wrote Cricket on the back of each one. It was so great. But yeah, like I was stunned. Like I was like, you don't know who like who doesn't know? And that was kind of one of my first tastes of like maybe things are a little, maybe things are a little different at my house than they are at the normal house. But
so you're about the same age as me, and I can't. I'm trying in my mind. I'm trying to think. What year did the Dukes of Hazzard come on TV?
I think that was around 1980 or 81, because I remember being in 7th grade.
Okay.
And I got in trouble. I was going to go to a friend's house and spend the night. Uh-huh. My best friend lived about 30 minutes away from us, because we just, like I say, we lived out in the middle of nowhere. And he lived over near Garner, and I wasn't allowed to go over that night because I'd gotten in trouble, so I stayed home. And I remember watching the spin-off show Enos, and just thinking, man, like I could be over in my friend's house in his neighborhood. Like he lived in a neighborhood, so like all his friends, I had a great time every time I went there. And I just remember thinking, instead I'm sitting at home watching fucking Enos. Like this, Jesus Christ, this is not the night that I wanted to have for myself at 12 or 13. But so I'm pretty sure it was 80, 81, 82, somewhere in there.
Okay.
It was on for a while though, wasn't it? It was on for what, 4 or 5 years?
It was on for like a decade.
Oh my God! Wow.
And I remember like the plot of Enos was that Enos gets a job with Metropolitan Atlanta Police Department or something, and moves to Atlanta and becomes like a big city cop, and it's like I think it was like a country mouse, city mouse kind of scenario.
Gotcha.
Of course, he, the country boy with his simple ways was always outsmarting the big city slickers.
Sure.
That was the moral of every story. I was talking to. I've tried to pitch this idea a couple times, and maybe I'll just do it myself. But growing up in Indiana with like Southern, family members. When I was a kid, there was a lot of like programming directed at like more rural oriented people.
Sure.
And I never realized until I got older, because of course I watched it all on reruns, but like late 60s, like the top rated shows are like Gomer Pyle, Andy Griffith, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres.
Yeah, sure.
The Hee Haw, when it was a network show.
Beverly Hillbillies, yeah.
And then that was all like killed off. They call it like the Rural Purge, I think, in 71. But I mean, as a kid, I just remember like so many shows like Moving On and BJ and the Bear and Sheriff Lobo and all of that stuff. And it, in the movies like Smokey and the Bandit and seeing stuff like that. But it just was such a different time, because that kind of culture was not. It wasn't looked down upon. I never felt, and it wasn't such a like the butt of a joke, I guess, kind of the way it is now, unfortunately.
I guess, yeah. I mean, not by you or me, but I guess it was by the networks. Like you're talking about, I remember my dad talking about that with someone. We they had a thing in Raleigh called the Raleigh. What was it called? Like the Raleigh Dinner Theater or something like that. And the guy who played Jethro, Max Baer Jr. came and did, you know what I mean? Because it was always somebody like that. Like it was like it was Bob Denver or
Bob Crane.
yes, or the guy, I can't remember his name, the guy who played Barnaby Jones and Jed Clampett, that whatever that actor's
Buddy
name was, I
Epson.
can't remember. Yes, so it was like those guys, you know, before, like now they'd be doing conventions and signing autographs for $100 per person, but at the time, you know, there was this sort of floating sort of area where, like, you know, guys like that were broke. The guys from Star Trek didn't have any money, you know. It was like you know, before that kind of the craze of the rerun set in, so those guys would do that dinner theater thing. And I remember my dad reading an interview in the paper with Max Baer Jr., and he was saying, yeah, I just didn't want to have anything to do with all that kind of hick stuff. And my dad was like, well, that hick stuff made you money, son, you know.
Yeah.
You know, but so, yeah, no, it was, I didn't like Petticoat Junction. I always thought that was really stupid, but I loved all those others, yeah, like Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres.
Yeah, and I'll still watch him if I catch him on,
sure,
you know, TV or something.
Sure.
Did you, so kind of growing up with that, like, very, like, positive Southern, you know, background and, you know, experience with music as a kid, when you got to be like a teenager, did you ever have like kind of a rejection phase of that where you're like, I'm punk now, I need to be, you know, do this?
I had a complete rejection of country music for sure, but it wasn't based on any kind of, it was purely based on me just not wanting to have the same taste as my parents, because so my mom, I haven't really talked about it all, but my mom was absolutely dedicated, and I mean 100, like annoyingly dedicated jazz, improvisational jazz piano player. Wow. So she listened to like Bill Evans and Oscar Peterson. She was from Charlotte, and she kind of a tortured soul, you know, drinking issues for sure throughout her life that kind of plagued her. You know, very, very well liked. She's the only person I've ever met, and I mean, obviously there are billions of people out there, but the only person I've ever met who saw Elvis. And I love I love all the Elvis kind of periods. I really do, but like the Elvis that people would say was kind of the prime Elvis. She saw him in 1956 in Charlotte.
What?
Totally.
Wow.
And went backstage and met him and all that, you know, because she was young, and I mean, she was like 15, and she and her friend went back there and they met him and stuff, and apparently he was a gentleman. But she saw him, you know, in 1956. But she also saw, you know, she was much more interested in like R&B and stuff like that, and she saw Fats Domino and Little Richard, and you know, just all like Clyde McPhatter, because he had some Durham connection. I'm not sure exactly what that was, but so she saw a lot of those people. But by the time I was born, she was obsessed with like Bill Evans, Oscar Peterson, and stuff like that. And she'd been a piano player and had gotten really into this improvisational jazz stuff, and she practiced constantly. And so, when I was a teenager, I just was like, I don't want to have anything to do with any of this. So I was, you know, so I rejected, you know, a lot of really good music, jazz, country, and anything that my dad liked, blues, you know, anything like that for the new the new orthodoxy of punk rock. But you know, I mean, like where I grew up, it was weird because where we lived in the country, I mean, there just weren't people out there. Like, it sounds kind of strange, but I mean, it really was isolated. There were neighborhoods. You can't even call them neighborhoods. There were like groups of houses, you know, in certain places, and maybe 5 or 6 miles away they had put up, I hesitate to even call it a subdivision, but there was it had a name. It was called Black Horse Run. That was like a place with houses. But I mean, where we lived, like, you know, it was down at the end of a gravel road that was, you know, at least a half a mile long. Mm-hmm. So it, you know, I don't know, man. I just wasn't around people, and I got sent to it. My grandmother had come into a bunch of money through her job. She'd gotten in kind of the ground floor of this textile company that just became huge. And so when she retired, she got this big payoff and offered to pay for us to go to private school, which I don't think my parents made many what I would call mistakes, but that was one of them because I just didn't fit in at all. I hated it. I wanted to go to school. You know, the high school I would have gone to where I took driver's ed, there were, you know, it was much more diverse. There were like heavy metal people. I don't remember any punk people necessarily because it was still kind of rural, but there were just different kinds of people, you know. At the private school there were rich white people and that was it. And so like you know, and I just didn't I wasn't interested in that. I didn't care about sports or any of that stuff, and so I was kind of the prime candidate for punk rock because I was angry a lot. I didn't like, you know, I mean, I guess educationally it was probably a decent education, but I just didn't fit in there at all. And so, you know, when I heard like the Sex Pistols and the Ramones, man, that stuff, like, that they were speaking my language as far as I was concerned, you know, which is kind of weird to think, especially with the Ramones, that like a bunch of guys largely singing about life in an extraordinarily crowded city, that I would find that relatable. But I guess it speaks to their ability as songwriters that, you know, I could relate to the part about being a bored, frustrated teenager, you know?
Yeah. And you know, that's the other thing of, you know, my sort of like, my theory about punk rock is that it's mostly about like sexual frustration and alienation and just not just like a questioning of authority in a general way. It's more of like a destruction, just of like a wholesale rejection of authority, and you know, like, you know, very anarchistic, very, you know, as I said, nihilistic, and I think for like a certain kind of kid, like I guess like maybe like a high IQ sort of social misfit kid, that's what resonated with me.
Sure.
Know?
Yeah. I mean, no, it was. I'm with you, and it was perfect. And as soon as I got into that, I don't really want to break things down like this and have it seem weird, but like, my best friend at that time was African American, and he lived in an African American neighborhood.
Uh-huh.
So when I would go over there, just hang out with all of them, which was in Wake County at that time, certainly kind of frowned upon, and definitely frowned upon by the people I went to school with. Make no mistake about that. Completely frowned upon by those people. There was maybe one or two black guys in my entire grade. And so when I got into punk rock, any semblance of friends I may have possibly had at that school, that was over. The black guys didn't care at all. Like they didn't give a shit. You know, they didn't care what I looked like or listened to or anything like that. But the white dudes that I went to school with, especially those guys, they hated it. And I was constantly, I mean, at one point, I got called into the principal's office. In private school, they have like elastic kind of clauses, you know, appropriate dress and things like that. You know, that's sort of up to the person judging at that time. And this kid had tried to set a desk on fire in my school, and tried to set a desk on fire. And the principal called me into his office because we didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of things. And he said, "I want you to know, man, that I stood up for you today. I just have to let you know that a woman called here and said, how can you suspend my son when you're letting people who look like John Howie walk around that school?" And I said, "Ma'am, you may not like the way he looks, but he doesn't try to set desks on fire. I'm sorry."
Yeah.
But, you know, so that was the kind of attitude that most of those people had, especially, you know, we're talking 84, 85 here, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I was okay, you know. It's not like I wasn't fitting in anyway because I wasn't particularly good at sports. I didn't care about sports.
Yeah.
You know, those just weren't things that I was interested in. I was into reading. I was into playing drums. I was into, you know, horror movies and stuff. You know, whatever. Yeah. Nothing that those people were into. And so you know, them thinking I was weird because I liked the Sex Pistols or whatever. I mean, they already thought I was weird. What difference did it make, you know?
Yeah. We lived in a, like a sort of a, not a cul-de-sac, but like a dead-end street. And so, you know, not like super far out, but I mean far out enough from town that like I could, walk to like a forest within like 10 minutes of my house, and
that's pretty cool.
And I could like go in the woods and shoot BB guns and
sure.
that kind of stuff. But it was a very pre-cable TV, cell phone. I tell my kids this story a lot. It was a very isolated existence. So you kind of like had to pick up on stuff where you could find it. And really before we got cable TV, like, I mean, I knew what punk rock was. Like you'd see it on like Quincy or, some TV show like that.
Sure. Chips.
Yeah, Chips, exactly. But I didn't know really what it was. There was like actually he still works for my family's business. He was about, he's probably 8 or 10 years older than me. But he was like the first person he like had a Stooges tape in his car, like his, 78 Monza or something. Right. And that was probably like the first time I'd ever heard like, punk music. But he was just like a country kid too. Like, I mean, he just liked it. He had no like allegiance to that style of music. But what really kind of changed it for me was when we got cable, and on a USA network, there was a program called Night Flight.
And I was just talking about that show the other day. That was a game changer in so many ways.
Oh, it was, and I still have a couple like old VHS tapes of it. I should probably dig them out. But do you remember that program on there called New Wave Theater?
Yep, absolutely.
That's how I found out about so many bands, because I try to explain it to my kids, and they just don't get it. But there was nothing. I mean, there was like metal magazines like Cream and Hit Parader and stuff like that. But you couldn't just like go into like the grocery store and peruse through the newsstand, and there was like Maximum Rock and Roll or something like that.
No, and we didn't have cable where I lived, but when I would go to stay with my friends, they had it, and I would always I got to see. Remember that movie with is it Diane Lane?
Oh, yeah.
Ladies and Gentlemen, the Fabulous Stains. Yeah, I saw that, and some things like that. That Night Flight thing was I'm totally with you. It was weird, like you would hear about. I remember I got my dad when I was 15 to drive me to Camelot Records in Cary, which was like, God, it was like 35, 40 minutes from where we lived, because they had a lot of cutout records,
Right.
And a friend of mine had been there and seen a copy of the first Sham 69 record. So we like called them. They said they still had it, but they refused to hold it. We got over there and it was still there.
Uh-huh.
But like, again, what you're talking about, it's like I couldn't just, turn on the computer and hear that whole thing. It was like I didn't know anybody who had that record
right
at all. And the only way I knew about that band is because I'd rented out the videotape of that movie, DOA. Have you ever seen that, about the Sex Pistols American tour? You ever seen that movie?
I don't know if I've seen that one.
So it's funded, I think it was funded by High Times.
Okay.
And this guy just goes to England and interviews some punks there, and there's footage of Generation X, X-Ray Specs, Sham 69, probably another band or two that I'm forgetting. And then he also, a big part of it is him kind of following around the Pistols on that ill-fated American tour. But it was a great, I'd never heard of any of those bands except maybe Generation X, because Billy Idol was getting big, but you couldn't find X-Ray Specs records, that was just, that was insane. So I rented that movie out. I rented it out 2 or 3 times. For some reason, this video store, like 10, 15 miles from our house, had it. I have no idea why. I'm sure I was the only person who rented that thing out. But my mom had a little realistic tape recorder, one of those. And I put that thing up, put it up to the speaker on the TV, and recorded the songs, off of that, because it was the only way to do that. But yeah, man, those were crazy those are crazy times. I'm sure you can remember like the thrill of like when you actually found something. Like, I'm not sure. I don't want to sound old. Maybe there's something that is analogous to that now for younger music fans. But man, like, I just remember like, whatever record it was, when I just happened to stumble across like a Stiff Little Fingers or whatever, like some band. Yeah. Just the joy, just the like, oh my God, it was like the greatest moment of your life,
When I was a kid, so we got cable. I remember being like middle school, 7th and 8th grade, and I think I had gone to like I can't remember. There was like Karma, which was like the local like kind of hippie run record chain, and then I think they had Camelot at the mall.
Right.
And I remember going in there, and I picked up Adam and the Ants, the first Ant Music, and then the Clash Combat Rock.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that would have been like, I don't know, 82, 83.
Sure.
And I really liked those records. And then we got cable when I was in 9th grade, so that would have been like 84, 85.
Right.
And I had started mowing lawns, and I could ride my 10-speed bike around and like mow lawns. So I got to this point where like I would go into the local, hippie run record store, and I'd have like $50 of lawn mowing money, and
sure.
I would get this old stoned hippie to like look up records in this big ass catalog,
Oh, that's so great.
And he's like,
I remember that giant book. I remember that giant record book where you'd just be like, it was like this. It was like a Bible, It's this magical document of every amazing record that you'd never see.
Yeah, he at one point. Sorry, I had to shut my window. There's a train coming.
That's okay.
There is at one point. I can't remember what I went. I think I went in and I'd heard like the name like Butthole Surfers or whatever. So I was like, that sounds cool. So I ride my red Schwinn 10-speed down to this hippie record store, and this old hippie's like stoned as hell, but he's got a neck brace on. He'd like broken his neck, and it wasn't just like the neck brace. It was the one with like the made your head stay still.
The drills that go, the little screws that go into your neck to keep your neck straight. Oh my God, man.
So he's thumbing through that big ass book, and he's got this crazy
with that square on your head.
Yeah, he's like. It
looks like a physics experiment or something. Yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah. It's so funny, and both my kids love music, and I'm very happy about that. But I don't know that like that joy of discovery is still there. I'm sure it is on some level.
I don't know either. I mean, and it's weird too to like trying to explain, like, because Adam and the Ants, that was a big gateway for me. I had a friend, one of the kids I went to school with when I was in 6th grade was British, and we sort of kind of glommed together, just being kind of different from everybody else. But anyway, and he had an older brother. I guess I was like 11 or 12, and his brother was maybe like 16. Okay, so he was 3 or 4 years older than us, and he was really nice, unlike a lot of, older brothers. He liked to, beat up his younger brother. And they were fresh over from England, and they went back. I guess his dad got transferred. Anyway, one time we were hanging out, looking at comic books, and his brother came in and was like, you like music? And I said, yeah, sure. I don't know what music I would have been listening to, but I started playing drums at that point. And so his brother broke out Kings of the Wild Frontier, which has Ant music on it, obviously. Yeah. And which I guess had probably just come out fairly recently in England. The second Police album, Message in, the one Regatta de Blanc, that one with Message in a Bottle, which I don't really kind of like now, but at the time, it sounded like it was from another planet, and he played those for me, and man, I just whipped, and I had saved up some money from allowances and doing chores, and I can distinctly remember when my dad picked me up that afternoon from his house, like begging him to take me to the local record store, which is called Record Bar. That was sort of a chain here, and they had a little import 7-inch section, and they had and music, and man, I wore that 7-inch single out. I just thought, man, it's, now, like, I mean, I think that stuff sounds kind of tame to people, like so much other music of that time, but at the time, man, Adam and the Ants, like, that sounded like a call to arms to me. It was revolutionary, and the way they looked, those freaky kind of pirate outfits and all that stuff. It was just, it was like they're from another planet, or like there was nothing, there's nothing like that in Wake County. They weren't stocking those records at Kmart. So.
You know what though? I think I do, or maybe I don't even know if I have it anymore. But I think I do have a copy of the Suburbia soundtrack that I bought at Kmart.
Wow, that's crazy.
I think it still has the Kmart tag on it.
That's crazy. And that was another one of those movies that, like, you sort of heard about. I mean, I may have read about it in Flipside or something, and then finally found you call like 10 video rental stores or however many there were in Raleigh, and you finally find one that's got it, because videotapes were like $100 to buy back then, and go get that thing, and there's TSOL in all their glory, there they are right there in your living room. That was such a huge deal.
Yeah, and Flea was in that movie.
Yeah, totally.
We had a video store, and we kind of lived out in the country, but there was like a little kind of suburban town, like a exclave, I guess you would say, of the main city where I live. And there was a video store called Edgewood Video, and it was that at one time, in the 50s and 60s, had been like a real hopping like commercial strip, but by the 80s it was like in decline. And so by the time I was able to drive, videos were going real big, of course. And for some reason, that video store had just the craziest videos. And at one point, he had like all of the Andy Warhol, like Flesh and Heat, and Andy Warhol's Dracula.
Andy Warhol's Dracula, sure, man. Yeah. I remember renting that out with Udo Kier, whatever his name was.
Joe D'Alessandro, yeah. And I would have to wait until my dad was like out of town, because one time I had gone there and I had rented A Boy and His Dog with Don Johnson.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And he was so pissed off. He's like, "You're not allowed to ever touch the VCR again."
Off limits from here on out.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's cool to like talk about the sort of like the analog experience of discovering like music and movies. But how did you transition from like someone who is I get the feeling, much like me, you're a very curious, intelligent, precocious teenager. How did you kind of start to transition away from like punk rock into more of where you're known as like a country singer songwriter? How did that kind of middle period go for you?
I mean, what kind of ended up happening was eventually, it's funny because I don't want to sound cheesy, but I think you can probably relate to this. Like, I feel like the whole punk, that's informed like my life and the decisions I've made and how I live my life and everything. Like, there's no question to me that, like, there are things that I just won't do. There are things that sometimes I find myself doing that I don't want to do because of just that. I don't know, that punk rock kind of changed my outlook on things. Or I'm not sure it changed them, but it sort of validated maybe the outlook that I already had on a lot of things. And I've been in situations, since then, like very recently, even like with bands, spending a lot of money on records or playing industry showcase and just doing stuff like that, and I just don't feel good about it because it's just not, because it's not punk, it's not punk rock. It just seems like a bad idea, and it seems disingenuous, and I don't like, God, I don't even like the last, the last couple of Clash albums, much less most of Joe Strummer's stuff, and Public Image, for however many years now I haven't liked. But it just never seemed to me like those guys, or Joey Ramone or whoever, I just never felt like those guys were ever bullshitting me. Maybe they were, but but I always loved seeing interviews with those guys, because even if I didn't agree with them, it was like, you're not full of shit. This is actually what you believe. This is how you feel. You're not saying this because this is some kind of packaged image that you're hoping to live up to, or that you've created to sell records or to get an audience. This is really who you are. And that appealed to me so much that, I've never really been able to go back. I don't know. I've never been able to kind of tolerate anything that's not like that, and I think a lot of that, Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard, George Jones, whoever, like, those guys have images, for sure, and people like those images and stuff. But it's not phony, Merle Haggard, went to prison. He did all of that stuff, and I just, the songwriting is so sincere to me and so honest, and never, it just doesn't seem fake, and
it's not.
And I think that's, to me, that's kind of the link, is just there's this like complete, there's this complete honesty.
Yeah.
I always really loved The Damned, because it just seemed like you guys are just like like the four kids, in kindergarten that you kind of didn't want to hang out with because they're just fucking nuts. You know what I mean? It's like, you're just always getting into trouble, and you're not mean at all. You just can't not get into trouble. Like, that's what that band was like to me, just like those kids grown up, having never stopped being like that. It just all seemed very real. But I after punk, I remember going to see the Bad Brains on Eye Against Eye. I'm really glad I went to that show, because they were so great. But I remember even at that kind of thinking, I'm getting too old for this, which is really, you know what I mean? I was like 17,
Yeah.
One doesn't, I've moved on to the Stooges or whatever. But somewhere in there, I got really into. I saw Johnny Thunders in 1986 at this club in Raleigh where all the punk bands played, called the Brewery. And the thing about that club is it had great sound. Okay, so it wasn't like it was not a dump. It was small, but the guys who ran it booked punk shows. I saw TSOL there. DOA, just shit tons of bands. That's where the Bad Brains played. And I saw Thunders there when I was 17, and it really blew me away. And I knew who the Dolls were, and I knew the Personality Crisis and stuff, but I'd never gone deep into that world.
Right.
And after that show, I started moving really into that kind of music. And got really into, and then that got me into like T-Rex and all those bands that you and I like eventually, like Slade and Sweet and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, especially with the Dolls, with that model, you're going to go back to the Stones, who I don't ever listen to now. I don't think I own a single record by them anymore, because I just can't. To me, those guys are like CEOs now. They've just kind of fucked it up for me. I don't know, and I mean, I just can't, but there was a time when I loved them, and that would be probably when I was 19.
Yeah.
Right in there, and if you love the Stones and you're a music fan and you read about them, sooner or later you're going to hear about Graham Parsons,
Right.
obviously.
Yeah.
And that was right in 1988 was right when CDs started coming out, 88, 89, and somehow I didn't have a CD player. My dad bought one for some reason. I'm not really sure why, but he did have one, and I got the Flying Burrito Brothers Best Of on CD, and I loved that, and I just flipped.
Yeah.
And then right around that time, I went to England when I was 19. I went to Europe. I dropped out of college. I wasn't really playing in a band. I was bumming around. I got a temporary job with the tax department, with the revenue department, just kind of doing bullshit, like literally like packing up forms and lifting, 50-pound bags of forms into trucks and stuff like that. And my dad came to see me. I was kind of crashing with this woman that I was sort of dating. And anyway, he came to see me and said, I kind of feel like you're sort of fucking up. I sort of feel like you're kind of wasting your life here, man. You're not doing any, it'd be one thing if you were in like bands or pursuing something, but you're not doing anything. So I found out that you were in college recently enough to where you're still eligible for this work exchange program. And he had the forms with him. And it was really good advice. He was just saying, you're only going to be this age once, man. Why don't you, go see the world,
Yeah.
You've got this job to where you're making money. You're not paying rent. You're crashing at some poor woman's house, probably eating all her food and stuff. So I did it. So I went to England with a work exchange program, briefly got a job through that program, but then I met these guys who had like a punk band. It was more of an American kind of sounding punk band, like they were into Rites of Spring and bands like that.
Right.
They'd done a Peel session.
Wow.
The guitar player had been in a British punk band called the Stupids, who over there were kind of big. And he had quit that band and started a new band, and they had a European tour lined up, and they needed a drummer, so I said yes. So, easy, yes, absolutely. So there I was 19, and we went to Holland, Belgium, France, Spain, Italy, Poland, Germany. We didn't go to, the wall was still up. We didn't go into East Germany. We were in West Germany. Several countries like that, and it was pretty great. There wasn't a whole lot of money floating around, but I didn't care. But I guess the point of all this is that the singer for that band didn't have the kind of stigma that I had around Hank Williams and Johnny Cash and stuff, because that wasn't music that his parents liked. So he loved it unashamedly, along with whatever the UK subs and Hanoi Rocks, and you know what I mean? Like he saw nothing contradictory about that. And that was the first time I think I'd ever heard someone who I considered a peer, saying positive things and such about, the kind of music that my dad liked. And when it was presented to me in that context, it was all of a sudden I just completely fell for it. When we were in Poland, I bought a Johnny Cash record for my dad that I was going to give him when I got back, and I ended up keeping it. It was all the Sun, all the Sun sides, and
right.
So that was kind of, because I'm pretty confident my dad probably knew who Graham Parsons was, because he liked Emmylou Harris and stuff. Sure. But he didn't have Sweetheart of the Rodeo, and he didn't have Gilded Palace of Sin. I could still kind of kid myself that was more my music than, you know what I mean, than it was his. But with Johnny Cash and stuff, there was no way to do that. I mean, he loved all that stuff. Yeah. So that was a big deal for me, was just being able to look at it and go, and be a little bit older and have a little more experience and not live with him and my mom anymore, so I could kind of look at it more from a more objective place and just go, okay, this is really good music. And once that happened, it was just on for me. And I knew how to look for records, at that point. And I was fortunate because my dad had, he had Merle Haggard records, and he had George Jones records, and also like Dwight Yoakam and things like that. And he'd kind of never given up on that. So I had a good and I think took like a certain amount of got a certain thrill out of being able to make these tapes for me of music that I had 3 years before swore I'd never listened to. I found that kind of enjoyable. So when that happened, I started falling in love with that stuff. And then when I was 23, 1992, I was playing drums in a band called Finger in Raleigh, and we were all really into, they weren't as much into Haggard and Jones and shit like that the way that I was, but they were into Parsons for sure. We were on Rhino Records, put out a Graham Parsons tribute around that time called Commemorativo, and we were on that. The bass player came to practice one night. I'd already moved to Chapel Hill, but he said, there's this band playing downtown. There's a blues club called Easy Streets. But they play that kind of, they play the stuff that you like, that kind of, Buck Owens, Merle Haggard stuff.
Yeah.
And I went down there, and it was this band called the Backsliders. And at the time, they ended up being a little more kind of rock and roll. They were still great. But at this time, they had a pedal steel player, which I'd never seen a band in a club with a pedal steel player. Like, my dad had taken me to see Jerry Reed and shit like that when I was a kid, but those were like the place where they had wrestling and stuff.
Yeah.
I hadn't been to like a club that my friends might go to, and so I saw that, and that for me was kind of like my version of whatever Joe Strummer seeing the Sex Pistols or whoever seeing the Velvet Underground. For me that was like, oh wow, well, like people, they were about probably 10 years older than me, but they weren't Conway Twitty's age,
Yeah.
So that was kind of the first time I saw people that seemed like they might have come from my world and were closer to my age, and they're playing honky tonk music, and I just thought, well, that's it, man. That's what I've been waiting for. So from there on, it was just a matter of honing my very, at that time, limited, and still pretty limited today, guitar skills,
Same.
and I learned it enough to write songs.
Yeah.
But from there on, it was just me trying to get ready for that, and because the one thing I knew is that I didn't want to kind of half-ass it.
Right.
And then a few years later, the North Carolina kind of alt country thing really started kind of blossoming, and though musically I didn't really feel a part of that, it did kind of make it easier because like there was a guy in Chapel Hill who'd been like a violinist kind of in sort of hippie bands, and all of a sudden he knew like about fiddle music, and he knew about Bob Wills, and he knew about Merle Haggard because people were talking about that stuff. Right. So I could get him in the band, and it all of a sudden just seemed like something that it was easier to find musicians to be able to play. I mean, it still took a while, and it definitely took me a while to find the right ones, but I could at least get some in there that could make it through the show,
Right.
That was a long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No, it's perfect, man. It's funny to me because like I had like I had that kind of like transitional period as well,
right?
And I had so my son was born in 1994, so that like a year before that I'd been playing with these dudes. And they were all like punk dudes, and I'm still friends with them to this day.
Sure.
And, but I think at that time I'd been like pretty well into rockabilly for a while, but only from like a kind of more of like a collector-ish kind of
Sure.
angle. And so I had all these like, you know, records and, you know, CD box sets and stuff, and like Sun, you know, Elvis Sun Sessions, of course, you know, fantastic. And Maddox Brothers and Rose, and
Oh, nice. Yeah.
and I knew Hank Williams, but I had never like, I mean, I grew up, you know, that was just kind of always around, but I'd never like really like dug in and listened to Hank Williams. And this friend of mine, I've talked about him like 2 or 3 times on the podcast now, but Alec Budd is his name.
Right.
And he had this like real funny voice, and he's like, "Oh, you really ought to check out Hank Williams. He's like the most emo songwriter you got ever. He's so punk." And so he turned me on to Hank Williams. I mean, I'd listened to it, but I'd never like listened to him as a songwriter. And then I read that Colin Escott book, and then it was just all over. And then that, you know, led me to like so many different people, like Lefty Frizzell and Ray Price and Carl Smith, and just, you know, down that whole rabbit hole. And at the time, like the rockabilly scene had really. The first U.S. Rockabilly Festival was in Fairmount, Indiana, in 1993.
Oh, wow.
I went to that. And then it kind of
Who
kept.
played that?
Who played it?
Were there older? Were there like what they call legacy acts? Were there like vintage rockabilly people, or was it all new bands?
It was mostly bands from the Midwest,
Okay.
and it was so this band from Chicago called Three Blue Teardrops. They just put out a new single.
I've heard of them, sure. Yeah.
And then you know J.D. McPherson.
Yep.
His bass player, Jimmy Sutton, his band, the Moondogs, they played.
Okay.
And then, the Del Lords, I think. This dude, Gino Finelli, I don't know if you know him, but he's
so.
sort of based
Okay.
in Knoxville. He's like a kind of a New Orleans jazz style guitar player.
Okay.
Where he plays with like an upright bass and a trombone. But
Okay.
he was there, and that was like a real thing, you know, big thing for me. And I kind of kept going towards like you know, more like roots oriented, you know, country. And it, you know, kind of when I started like playing in earnest, it was like in, you know, punk bands, but then my songwriting really started to kind of develop, and just kept going more toward like a confessional, you know, emotional kind of thing. And then I had a kid and got married and got divorced, so that was like a vein of gold for songwriting.
Well, yeah, I think that's like a big part of it. I mean, when I got back from Europe, like my uncle died right when I got back. He was a chain smoker. He smoked more than anybody I ever saw, and so he got emphysema. He was starting to get better. He'd quit smoking, but then he got pneumonia, and his lungs just couldn't, you know, they weren't strong enough to fight it. So he died when he was about 60. But right around that time, there was a used book and record store in Durham, and I met my dad there for lunch. I was living in more kind of downtown area of Raleigh before I moved to Chapel Hill. This would be like 1990, and you know, they had a big section of George Jones used records, and I went, you know, can you help me pick one of these out, pick out a good one for me, you know? And he picked out this really hideously ugly 2-record set, but what it ended up being was all the United Artists,
early,
you know,
stuff. Yeah.
and She Thinks I Still Care was the first song on it. And man, as soon as I heard that, I was like, well, Jesus, you know, like, because I'd experienced by that point, I'd gotten back from Europe, dated this girl that I had liked for years. We went out for like a month, and I thought it was going to last forever. It was great, been waiting forever for this, and it was great for that month. And all of a sudden, she was like, "Yeah, you know, I'm sorry, man. I'm not into it. I like you a lot, but I'm not into you that way." So, you know, for me at that time, it was a huge heartbreak. It was devastating, and you know, I think what you're talking about, like, I'd experienced, feelings of isolation, displacement, heartbreak, loss from my uncle dying, all that stuff. I was a prime candidate. I was as much a prime candidate for honky tonk music as I had been for punk rock.
Yeah.
7 or 8 years earlier. And so hearing that, to me, if you're in the right frame of mind for George Jones, like the first time you hear that, it's just, it knocked my socks off. I must have listened. I sat there and smoked my Marlboro cigarettes and listened to that. Just listen to She Thinks I Still Care. I just kept putting the needle back at the beginning. I must have listened to it 20, 30 times. Just couldn't believe it. It's like, man, this is just so great,
Some of the best records I've bought and the ones that just like really linger are ones that I bought at like a cutout bin, either at like a used record store or some like mainstream record store with, a bunch of like, throwaways, or even like gas stations.
Yep.
One I got at a gas station was the Velvet Underground VU, and it was on a cassette. I bought it at the Milk Barn on Nickel Avenue in Edgewood, Indiana.
That's crazy.
That is still probably my top 5 of favorite records. I can put it on. I know every word to every song. But another one I bought that was equally as influential was I was at this I can't remember the name of it, some outlet mall bookstore, where they just have all the like unsold cookbooks and crappy,
Edgar Allan Poe stories with terrible illustrations.
Yeah, all that. So I'm leafing through the CDs, and I see this George Jones CD, and I pull it out and set on the spine, Hardcore Honky Tonk Volume 1. And
that's a great album. I've got that. Jesus, so that's insane.
And it's got that picture like the young George Jones with the cowboy hat and
the hat. Yeah.
Wow. And I pulled it out, and it was like $2. And
God, that's crazy.
Yeah, and I had a Ford Ranger, an '88 Ford Ranger with a tape deck, so I had to take it home, drive back on my Ford Ranger, take it home, tape it, and then I, listened to it in earnest in my truck. And at the time, I was like doing a property management job, and so I was driving around all the time. I would just listen to that over and over and over. I mean, I probably listened to it every day, probably a half dozen times a day for 3 or 4 months. Because it just the power of his vocal performance and the way he could like bend his voice around words and his phrasing. I mean, it just still to this day, I still put it on occasionally, and I'm just like, this dude.
It's like Judy Garland or something. It's just ridiculous when he does like Mr. Fool and stuff like that. It's just like, what planet produced that? Because it can't be Earth. I mean, like, how is that possible? No, I'm with you. Yeah, it's magnificent stuff. Magnificent stuff.
Yeah, and him as a person, like I've read at least one of his autobiographies, maybe 2, but. I never was struck by George Jones as like, he's obviously a driven, industry savvy guy, but he wasn't like what I would say was like a deep guy, like intellectually.
No, I don't think so.
And
I don't get that impression at all.
Yeah, and he was friends with this local musician, and it was the dude that he wrote Out of Control with.
Oh, wow.
And his name will come to me in a second. But, even in like the one CD I have of the local dude, he talks about his friendship with George Jones, and he's like, yeah, he was an incredibly difficult, aggressive drunk, and I, would have to like babysit him when he would come to Indianapolis, because he would just like get into fights and just all of this like craziness. And so it's just incredible. Like I don't know where that came from, man. I don't know where George Jones' vocal talent came from, but I'm not a religious person, but I would say it was God sent. I mean, it's just.
I mean, there has to be like because I don't get the impression that he was, as a guy sitting around reading books and doing things like that at all. but man, there has to be something within him. If you're that good at articulating those dark emotions, there's gotta be, there's something within you that is very deep. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just depth of feeling. Maybe it's just your ability to connect with emotions. I'm not sure, but it's intense, but because just the things he could do with those songs, it's just unbelievable. And what you're talking about, like that hardcore honky tonk, is that Mercury stuff or something like that? Mercury, yeah. With Mr. Fool and Just One More, Accidentally on Purpose. I think one of the great tragedies is George Jones, stopping writing songs, because he wrote he wrote Accidentally on Purpose, and some others like that. A Window Up Above, he wrote that.
Oh, yeah.
Those are just mind-blowing, man, and I think I've heard him say things like, well, I got to the point where I had access to the best songwriters in Nashville, but you were one of those, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you were a great songwriter, man. There's no reason for you to give that up, but I'm with you. I don't know what, and it may be that kind of him feeling things to that degree is what caused him all those, issues with alcoholism and all the shooting up his house.
The bus.
There's that, yeah, totally. There's that story about after Tammy finally, I guess, just had enough. He went down to Florida to live with some friends or relatives, and he was saying in one of those books that he would kill like a fifth of Jack Daniels, drive all the way to Nashville, park outside their house for 30 minutes, and then drive back. Yeah. And that's just crazy. That's tortured soul on a level that, I don't ever want. And I feel like I've been close enough, but that's a lot of driving, man.
Yeah.
I've done the drive by, but I haven't done it for 12 hours or however long of a drive that is.
Right.
So clearly he was feeling things. By the time we played with him, it seemed like he was in a really good place, and that was 7 or 8 months before he died. But he was, he had his life, man. His wife, Nancy was there, and she was, making that happen. And it seemed like he seemed like a man much more at peace with himself. But some of that footage of him from the 70s in particular, like, good God, man, it just looks like you're definitely not eating. And I don't, have you seen that footage of him where he accepts the award, and I guess he's so drunk, the only people he can see are like Kitty Wells and Johnny Wright, who are sitting in the front. He's like, and I love Kitty Wells and Johnny Wright. It's like, man, then he leaves, it's like, man, you're not worth a damn right now, dude. Jesus. Wow. And I think that was like 82. I think that was for, He Stopped Loving Her Today, or one of those early 80s hits. And he's just so fucking drunk. He just can't, anyway, so.
Yeah, I remember being in high school, and I don't know when it was actually shot, but there's that footage of him, getting pulled over by the police officer.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, oh, Lord, I don't need this. And, one of my friends, in high school telling me that story, like, you remember, that dude, George Jones, he was on Cops or whatever it was, or I don't know, Current Affair or whatever show it was. And, and I look at that, and then I compare that to, I can't remember the name of the song, the one really fantastic duet he does on TV with Tammy Wynette, where they're standing, like, really close to each other, and she just like gives him this look in the eye, and you can just tell he's on the verge of tears because their marriage is like just getting ready to fall apart. But they both like look at each other dead in the eyes, and you can just tell they're like about ready to break down completely, and they just like finish the song like completely professionally, and take their bows and like walk off the stage. And I would say of all people, he's probably like my main guy. Like he's.
Oh sure, yeah. It's hard to. I Lefty Frizzell, and I love Haggard, and I love Ernest Tubb and Charlie Pride. Like, there's a lot of people, but yeah, there's something he's got that just is like next level, you know.
Yeah.
And I think most of those guys would probably agree with us.
Oh
that,
yeah,
you know.
Yeah, I would too. So Laddie Moore was the guy from Indianapolis. I remember.
Oh sure, man! I've got that CD.
Yeah, I'm not broke, but I'm badly bent.
Yeah, that's got some amazing stuff on it. He's not still alive, is he?
No, man. He was always one of those dudes that I had his name and number. I think it's even in the CD case, and I always meant to look him up. I mean, I always meant to call him and like, hey, could I do an interview? Because he lived in somewhere in Kentucky. I can't remember exactly where it was, but not like on the other side of Louisville, I think. So maybe like 2 hours for me. But same deal. Like just just a fantastic performer, and had like great stories about George Jones, and I don't know, man.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, when I think about all that, I had a friend that was real tight with Charlie Feathers, and he was always trying to get me to come down there and hang out with him, and I just kind of made excuses, and then I was like, I was an idiot. What on earth is wrong with me? Oh my God. And I remember when I was like 24 or something, he was like, man, you really ought to come down here. Like, he's nice. Like, he's kind of crazy, but we can go over there. He's got like a VCR. We can just hang out and watch movies with him. And I was like, I don't know, man. Tennessee, that's a ways away.
We did that. So about a month before my son, well, not even a month, like a couple of weeks before my son was born, this crazy friend of mine, I was like, knew I was going to be a dad, and like he was like just getting ready to go away to college. So I was like, let's take a road trip. Let's go to Memphis and Nashville, like, long weekend. It's only like, Memphis is like 5 hours from here. Nashville's about 4. So we take off and we get down to Memphis, and this would have been 94, summer of 94. And we get down there, and we saw like a poster or something, like Charlie Feathers live at the Rebel Inn, and he was a couple years younger than me, so he was not 21, but we'd already gotten into a couple bars in Memphis. So I was like, you want to chance it? And he's like, I don't know, man, I don't know. And I was like, well, Charlie Feathers is there, and he's I don't know, I'm kind of tired, let's just try another time. And of course he died not long after that.
Yeah, sure. I would have loved to have seen him. Those records are so good.
Yeah, I mean, I think like near the end he was like in a wheelchair or something, and just very.
Well, yeah, I had a friend that got his job moved out to Boston in the late '80s, or maybe no, before that. I'm sorry, it was probably the mid '80s, and he saw Charlie Feathers like 3 times, and he had all these 45s that he bought from him that were on these tiny, I guess his own labels, because I guess there was still a rockabilly scene up there, so they would take him up there, and I'm like, but I live in the neighboring state, where I'm right next door to his home state, and I've never seen him. Are you fucking kidding me? Is there any way we can continue this? I'm going to have to go. I'm so sorry. Can we make it a 2-parter? Is that possible?
It's up to you, man. I mean, I can find a place to taper it off if you need to go.
I'd love to keep it up if you want. We don't have to. But man. I gotta get my son some food. It's that time for sure.
Yeah. Why don't you make him something to eat, and when you're ready to go, just give me a text and we'll get the recorder going again.
That sounds good.
Yeah,
thanks, man.
All right.
Appreciate it. I'll talk to you in a little bit. Bye.
John had to break away for a few minutes to make dinner for his son, but he was gracious enough to call back and finish our chat.
All right, we're rolling. So, real quick, if you don't mind, so how did you kind of get going with the $2 Pistols?
I started that band in 1995. I was in a band called June. I was still a jobbing drummer, and I got a gig playing for a band here that was starting to get really popular. Their drummer quit, and there was this sort of bidding war for them, Sony and Geffen and some labels like that. They ended up signing to the American arm of Beggar's Banquet, but they called me because I was, one of the drummers in town, and said we'd like, we'll pay you. Could you, come join the band? So anyway, we went to Nashville to record the album, and I had really, had it in my mind at that point to start this new group, and I tried to do it with some friends, and that didn't work. And so while we were in Nashville, this would have been 95 again, Lower Broadway was just starting to really kind of happen, at that time. It was nothing like it is now. And BR 549 were playing at Roberts a lot, and I went to see them a bunch. And so kind of seeing that thing happening and realizing that there really was kind of something going on. When I came back to Chapel Hill after we made that record, I started the band in earnest as a side project for sure, because I was playing drums in this band that had a record deal and getting paid to do that. But then that band broke up, and I thought rather than keep playing drums, I'll really focus on the Pistols. And for whatever reason, the Pistols pretty much from the word go could draw reasonably well. And then we got offered a record deal with a local label, and so that was enough for me. That was enough to kind of encourage me to keep doing it. And from there on, it kind of grew in this weird arc, because people would come and go. We made a studio album, then we made a live album, then we made an EP with Tift Merritt, and then we just kind of did nothing for 3 years while I kind of reorganized the band and some things like that. And then we sort of hit what to me is kind of the stride of the group. We put out an album called You Ruined Everything. Yep. And then we put out Hands Up. And then Here Tomorrow Gone Today. And that was it. But, again, when I was like, when I was like 21, 22, right in there, and especially around the time I first saw the Backsliders, I just sort of, from that point on, man, I was already writing songs, and at some point I just decided to kind of, instead of writing them for whatever band I was playing drums for, like, because I'd play in rock and roll bands, power pop bands, whatever, I just decided to sit, you know what I mean, you write to fit the group. I decided to just kind of sit down and write songs and see how they came out, and they came out in this sort of honky-tonk country style, and I just, well, if that's what naturally is supposed to happen, then that's what I'm going to do, because it's, at that point, certainly, and probably still now, I guess, just kind of my favorite music. So,
yeah, those are...
Never stopped,
Yeah, those are all great records, man. There's definitely a time, and I know we've, like, kind of, like, privately talked about this, but, like, there was a, like, so, like, what people think of as country music today,
right?
I think I can speak for myself. I don't know if I can speak for you, but, like, the conception for me is, like, quite a bit different than, like, what it is to me versus what people think of as country music today. And then I don't mean, like, mainstream music. I mean sort of like neo outlaw or, new, whatever you call that style of music. But what I always go back to is I love that, like, late 90s, early 2000s, like, very heavily influenced by Buck Owens and Merle Haggard, like Bakersfield sound.
Yeah, that was a huge thing, back then. It seemed like, for whatever reason, as opposed to, it seems like a lot of it's kind of Waylon now, which is fine, obviously, but but back then it seemed like there were a lot of groups that were really into that.
Yeah,
I'd kind of discovered that Buck Owens thing, and it was like the Rosetta Stone.
And I fully would put the $2 Pistols in the pantheon of the Derailers and the Domino Kings and a lot of those just, like, fantastic bands that were around at that time. And,
well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I loved those groups. It was a fun time for sure. Like, and it was weird too, because there weren't as many. It seems like there's a lot of kind of country band or country stylish, I don't know, bands now, but back then, like, you'd go on tour and, like, even in some place like Birmingham, Alabama, there just wouldn't be like a young, country group or something. So you'd play with like, an indie rock band or something like that. And,
right.
That would just be the way that it ended up. I mean, it wasn't like, you were listening to the music then. It wasn't like it is now. I mean, you were kind of, if you were doing that, honky tonk country, you're sort of out in the weeds, man. There wasn't, some website or whatever with, with all this constant, talk about new country bands and whatever latest, like outlaw, whatever thing happening. There just weren't, you go to Texas and sure, you'd have Dead Watson and the Derailers and that, but, by and large, those bands kind of stayed there.
Right.
The Derailers would get around because they were on major labels and stuff, but a lot of those bands, would just kind of stay in Texas. So, yeah, so when you were in New York or whatever, you didn't know who you were going to end up playing with, and people would not know, how to kind of react to you. I mean, I remember when Little Stevens, when the Outlaw Country thing on Sirius XM, when that channel hit, we were well into our career at that point. I think that was right when we came out with Hands Up. We'd been together almost 10 years at that point,
oh, wow.
Before there was even anything like that. Mm-hmm. So it really was like, what do we do? Well, we just keep playing clubs, but there wasn't the kind of network I think that there is, now. You were really, it was definitely like you're just kind of out in the weeds. Here we are, we're the country band. How's it going?
Yeah, and it's funny too because, like it seemed like there was like that kind of like more like, Bakersfield influenced style of like, new country. But then at the time, like I remember like No Depression and like the Bloodshot bands being like such, that just seemed like so pervasive. And honestly, man, I mean, nothing against any of those bands or labels or anything. I just never got into it. Like a couple people would play things for me and I'd be like, oh, that's okay. But it never like grabbed me in the way like a band like the $2 Pistols would.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that wasn't my scene either. I wasn't running out buying those records, by any stretch of the imagination. I was into, there was a band from Athens, Georgia called the Star Room Boys, and I liked them a lot. We played with them a lot. They were pretty honky tonk, but I liked the guys that's blind, Justin Trevino. I liked him a lot from Texas. No, I was never into that kind of whatever insurgenty country.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. That just wasn't my deal. I mean, I like Jason and the Scorchers, but that's different,
Yeah.
That's pretty song-based music. Yeah. And we were very conscious, like, about, I loved Michael Nesmith, and I loved the Burrito Brothers, and I loved a lot of that country rock stuff, but I made a very conscious decision for a long time to not let the influence of that music infiltrate what we were trying to do. I was not against, and because I don't think those records, the $2 Pistols records, sound necessarily retro. They do in comparison to, what was being played on the radio at that time, or certainly is now. But I wanted to distance myself as much as possible, from being part of any kind of like, alternative country. That was a term I was never particularly comfortable with, because some guys would kind of use that as an insult, like somehow like you were jumping on some bandwagon or something like that, which was kind of a joke. I mean, I grew up in a trailer in the woods, and like my grandfather was a Presbyterian minister. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think you're not going to out Southern me or anything. pretty sure I've got the cred, you know.
Yeah,
but,
exactly. Same.
but people would, you know, people would get suspicious, and some journalists and fans and even other musicians would kind of use that as an insult. And I had kind of tunnel vision, you know. I mean, I wanted that music to be, to me, like what it should have ended up sounding like. Mm-hmm. You know, because to me, I mean, you know, you take, you know, Ernest Tubb, you know, there's Roy Acuff, Ernest Tubb, whatever, but then you've got Hank Williams, who kind of took that stuff and sort of added something to it, and then you get, you know, George Jones, who took that and added something to it. Buck Owens took that and added something to it, and then Waylon, you know, the same kind of thing. So there's certainly progress, and or I'm not sure that's the right word, but there's certainly, you know, there's an evolution there,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's not, you know, changing it completely. Like, it still has the whatever it is that makes it this thing that we love is still present. You know, by the mid '90s, I think that was pretty much gone, other than like a pedal steel guitar. You know, it was like it become this weird amalgam of like stadium rock and crappy songs,
yeah,
and lame ass production, you know, and I don't know. It's so to me, like bands like Two-Dollar Pistols and the Derailers and stuff were like, to me, that's what that music should have ended up sounding like, and it just didn't, because people figured out that they could make, you know, $9 million doing, you know, marketing it as country. But it's like telling somebody that ice cream is a popsicle all of a sudden or something. You know what I mean? It's like, you know,
it's a soft popsicle. Yeah,
you know, if you tell enough people that a popsicle is now called ice cream, then they're going to start calling it ice cream. You know, it doesn't matter that it's not fucking ice cream. You know, so that's kind of the way I see country music, is it's like, you know, it retains some of the elements. You know, a popsicle's still frozen. This music still has a pedal steel guitar. The guy singing it still has a hat and cowboy boots. But other than that, right, it's kind of lost all the things that I like about it. You know.
Yeah, I was explaining to my son, like we took off today. We were like, I think we started off like listening to Slade, and he's just like, yeah, I've never really like got into Slade much, and I'm like, yeah, they're great, you know, like Sweet's one of my favorite band, but like I really like Slade too, and so we just, you know, got to talking about like Quiet Riot and how they had like, you know, 2 big hits with like Slade songs.
Sure.
And so that kind of led into this like conversation. It was like, what else was popular when that was on the radio? And he's like, you know, we're listening to like Come On Feel the Noise. He's like, I can't believe this was like a pop song. And I was like, it wasn't a pop song. This was like this. I think it was a #1 hit song. And so that led into this discussion about how radio, and I mean even MTV too, but like just radio, pop radio, there was a variety where you could listen to pop radio. I mean, up through the 80s and even through the 90s, you got like some rock music, you got some R&B music, you got some kind of more like folky, like country music. And it really wasn't until, I don't know, I would say like the late 90s, I guess, where everything got like siloed off, where it was like, only country, only R&B, only rock, and like, and within these silos, we have our definition of what country is. So like, every country song began to sound like Garth Brooks, or you know, and it like eventually became like Big and Rich, or you know, something like
Kenny
that.
Chesney, sure,
yeah, and it left no room. I mean, even like, you know, you go back to like the '60s. And like Jimmy Martin was like a huge country star, but
the Osborne Brothers too.
Yeah, the Osborne Brothers. But you know, playing bluegrass, and you know, and now whenever
which
like
didn't sound like Roger Miller, which didn't sound like Buck Owens, which didn't sound like Jack Green. You know what I mean? So there was all these different.
Yeah, there was room for the variety, and I think that's the bummer I see is, I mean, even with like the new like kind of Waylon Neo Outlaw stuff, it's like, yeah, that's cool too, but like there's a lot of other, you know, cool stuff out there too. And I guess my next question would be like, did you ever get sort of like tired of like banging your head against the wall and just be like, I'm just going to write personal songs and who likes them, and if not, you know, that.
I mean, that's kind of where, that's where I'm at now, man.
Yeah,
I mean, if you look at my Spotify, like, for Not Tonight, I mean, my Spotify thing is messed up, and I hate that this is even a consideration, but, like, there's TLR Pistols, which that one does pretty well. Right. There's Rosewood Bluff, which does okay, but Not Tonight, I mean, that thing had, like, 50 listeners last month. It's just not, you know.
Wow.
It's just nothing, you know. So, to me, like, you know, I was never comfortable, though, and again, this kind of goes back to punk rock or whatever. I was never comfortable doing music industry showcases with photo ops, having my picture taken with the right person, being nice to the right person because they could help me even if they were an asshole, you know.
Right.
Just like at the end of the day, man, you know, I mean, what would Joe Strummer do, or you know, whoever those people are, and if that means that only 50 people listen to my record in a month, then so be it. You know, I mean, I get to sleep well. I'm happy with the legacy that I have. I didn't kiss anybody's ass to get there. I didn't create a phony image of myself so that, you know, a bunch of people in their 30s would think I was some awesome badass swinging from the chandeliers with 10 bottles of fucking whiskey or whatever. Like, you know, what you see, what you hear, that's what you get. You know, that's a troubled person with you know, a lot of the problems that most people have. But you know, I think Swamp Dogg himself once said I wasn't going to sing some songs about how I was getting laid all the time and I was some kind of tough badass who'd kick your ass, because that would be a lie, you know.
Right.
And I'm on his side, man. You know, I mean, like, you know, I sing about relationships for the most part, you know, because I've been married twice. I'm a single dad, you know. That's a bottomless well of inspiration for me, because obviously I don't, you know, have not had great success with those. So that's what I sing about. And I think most of the music that I've liked over the years, it's not, you know, I mean, I've listened to bands that were very successful, but a lot of the bands that I loved and that you've loved, you know, those guys banged their heads against the wall their entire careers. That doesn't make me love their records any less. Mm-hmm. Some of those records have changed my life, you know.
Right.
So to me, at the end of the day, I feel like, considering how stubborn I've been about my career and about the way my records sound, I've gotten pretty lucky, you know. I've got some songs in TV shows and movies, and those are decent. I've been in some bands that have wanted to take it further. I mean, been willing to do things to take it further. So sometimes I get money from those. But, you know, for me, man, like, this is going to sound really cheesy, but a guy just sent me a message that I don't know, mm-hmm. telling me that his sister had died. Oh. And she had an illness, and she had been, you know, on the way out for some time. And he had to drive a long way to see her right before she died. And he said, and I listened to your music all the way there and all the way back. And I just want to thank you for making the music that you make. And to me, and I'm not trying to be hokey, but to me, man, that's worth far more than, you know, the guy at Saving Country Music thinking I'm good, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the way that I look at it, you know. I mean, I'm 50 fucking years old. I mean, I get to, you know, I can usually play somewhere and 100 people will show up and they seem happy.
Yeah.
You know, there are just more important things, you know, than a bunch of people, you know, being fawning sycophants. Yeah. You know, I don't know. I mean, it was weird. Those TLR Pistols days, you know, like, I remember seeing the Derailers when Here Come the Derailers came out, which I think is a fantastic album.
Right.
That was right around the time You Ruined Everything came out. They're within 6 or 7 months of each other, I believe. And I went to see the Derailers. Now, think about this. At the time, they're on a subsidiary of Sony.
Uh-huh.
They were being played on CMT.
Yep.
Full tour support.
Yep.
They were touring, 300 days a year, probably?
Yeah. Probably.
And I saw them at the club here, Local 506, that I think holds 250 people.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't sold out. And I just remember thinking, and they were great. They're an amazing band. And I just remember thinking, well, this is the way it is. This is the way it is. This is not me. If you're going to make music like this way, even if you're afforded all these opportunities, it's just not going to be thousands of people.
Right.
Maybe that's changed. But at the time, I didn't care, because A, I was seeing a great show. Mm-hmm. I was happy that there was another band that I felt like, was kind of looking at music the same way we were, that was out there doing it.
Right.
But I do remember thinking that. I remember thinking, this is a hell of a band working their ass off with a lot of opportunities to be pulling 150 people.
Yeah.
And I think that's just the way it goes sometimes.
Yeah. And I, man, to close it off, I agree. Like, at the end of the day, whether you're being a dad or doing a day's work or writing a song, it's got to be about the work, man. It's got to be about the effort. It's got to be about sincerity and putting your heart into something. And if you can't do that, what are you really doing?
Yeah, I agree. I just don't have any. I don't know. I can be pretty self-confident about my work for sure, but I'm not cocky. I'm not a narcissist. I don't need, I don't need a bunch of people telling me that I'm great. It sounds stupid, but I like to have, having the respect of my peers, to me is really cool. And but I have friends who don't make records, who have played me songs that they've written that are as beautiful as anything I've ever heard.
Right.
And I don't know that they ever will make records. They may just play them for their friends sometimes, and there was definitely a period, I don't know if you've kind of gone through this, and I'll probably may go through it again, where I was like, this is frustrating. I'm making these records that I think are great. And, at the height of the biggest selling Pistols record, I think, was the one we made with Tiff Merritt. I think that's around 12,000 copies. And that came out, almost 20 years ago this year.
Right.
The rest of them, 2,000 or 3,000. I think You Ruined Everything might be up to 3 or 4. But there was definitely have been times when I'm like, what do I have to do? I'm giving you everything I got, and it's just not enough. But I haven't looked at it that way in a while, and I don't really want to go back to looking at it that way, because I think when you start looking at it like that, then you start doing things that take away from what it is that's good about what you do, like maybe compromising how you, even saying compromising how you promote the records. Then all of a sudden you're not the person, that you know what I mean?
Totally.
I don't like Scott Walker's music after about 1980. Okay. I just don't. I don't like the Drift. I don't like Tilt. I don't like the record with Sun Ho, or however you say that band's name. But there's no question to me that were he not the guy who made those records, I'm not sure that I would feel as strongly as I do about the music he made that I do love. If he'd gone to Vegas and was just there the rest of his life singing The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore, I might not have quite the respect for him that I do have.
Right.
Because he did exactly what he wanted to do. The fact that I don't care for it is pretty inconsequential as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
It's more that he was an artist, he was creative, his motivations were clearly music.
Right.
Not stardom, not even frankly paying the bills. It doesn't seem like. It was more just like, I've got to make this music that I want to make. I don't care for a lot of it. That doesn't matter. The respect I have for him as an artist kind of outweighs that to me.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, I think that's a quality in creative people that's kind of, I don't want to think that it's like passing away, but I think it's harder for people to appreciate it. I think having like a very personal, sublime quality that's not obsequious, I think is very difficult for people to like patiently sit and listen and like to engage with music. And yeah, man, you're right. At the end of the day, you've got to do the work. You've got to like, follow your compulsion and like get it pushed out there. And
totally. Especially with social media, I think too, because there's so much pressure now to like constantly be posting things and make it seem like you're living this life that you're not. It's like the world is based around being phony now. It's like that's a prerequisite of being alive, is presenting this image of yourself that's not real, and that goes against like all the people that we love. That's the antithesis of Merle Haggard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or the Sex Pistols, for that matter. Even though like a band like that really used the media, they actually were getting knifed and stuff like that, and beaten up on the subways and things like that. Like it wasn't pretend.
I think I would probably, like I follow Steve Jones on Instagram.
Sure.
And he's pretty funny. He's pretty cool. But like, he's just goofing. He's just like
having a good time.
Yeah, he's just having a good time. I don't know.
And self-deprecating too, which I think a lot of people aren't capable of anymore.
Yeah, very much so. But in my mind, I try to imagine like him in like 77. Like, what if Instagram had existed in like 1977?
God only. It's probably a good thing it didn't, man. Yeah.
Like he's him and Sid get control of the Sex Pistols Instagram.
Good Lord. Yeah.
So that's the thing, is like, I don't know. There's the people that you admire. It's like, would they even make it in an age of social media?
Exactly. Yeah. I don't think they would have known what to do.
No. I don't know, man. At the end of the day, I think you're probably the same way. It's just like, I got to have a lot of good experiences. I got to see a lot of cool bands. I got to meet a lot of cool people, and I got to do some good work that I was proud of. And
Totally, absolutely.
What are you? So, what are you doing with Not Tonight as far as playing out for the rest of this year? Do you have many travel plans?
Right now we've got, we just got back from New York, as you know, and we got back from Rhode Island, and, let's see, we're playing in Wake Forest this weekend. We're headlining a festival in Washington, North Carolina. We're playing 3 or 4 times in May. We play about 3 or 4 times a month. Right now we're not going back out that far. It's hard for me because I have my son all the time. And that just has to be the focus of my life. It just has to be. And, I'm not going to be on my deathbed, assuming I have a deathbed, and going like, gee, I wish, instead of spending a bunch of time raising my son and having this great relationship with him, I wish I'd been, in a van in Appleton, Wisconsin, with a bunch of people, getting shit hammered, or what I mean. I love all that, but like, at this point, like, there are priorities. But so I play when I do, when I can. I love the live performance, and I love my band right now. A really good band right now. It's nice. Nice to have a really good band, as you know. It makes life a lot easier, but I just, my motivation is not, I'd love it if I woke up tomorrow and 20,000 people had bought Not Tonight, but I just don't feel like, I've never felt like, the records I make are designed for mass consumption. I just think they're just too stubborn. They're too individual. They're just too, not something that the casual music listener is going to run out and buy and kind of party to. They're just not. I just don't think they're necessarily designed for that. Like so much of the music that I listen to now. I don't know. 40,000 people who are running out every day buying, Ernest Tubbs catalog, and I don't think that's happening anymore. Whoever we can, Sean Bonnewell, I just don't, like, I would be far more surprised if that did happen, than if it didn't. And I'm not sure how I would deal with it. I'm not sure how I could deal with it, So to me, like, I'm pretty happy. I mean, people put my records out, as long as there are people willing to put my records out and, 100 people willing to come see me play when I play, a couple hundred people willing to come see me play, that's perfectly good enough for me, at this stage of the game. I mean, I got, Peter Holzapfel, who was in the DBs and REM and the Continental Drifters, is doing a residency here at a local club, and he just invited me to, come do 4 songs with them the other night. So I did that, So to me, cool. Like, it was a great time, and his drummer Will Rigby from the DBs also played with Steve Earle and Matthew Sweet. So I got to play with some top-notch musicians who are nice people, and like, it was, made a little bit of money, so we're good, you know what I mean? Like, and I didn't have to, get in a van with 4 other people to do that. I drove, 20 minutes, so, man, I just kind of rolling along, taking it as it comes, and you know how it is. If you're a songwriter, you're a songwriter. If you're in that mode, you're going to write those songs, whether or not 20,000 people are whether or not you have a mandate from that many people or not. You're still going to write them. So, keeping on.
Right on. Well, hey man, thanks a lot for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for talking to me. It's been a blast.
Yeah, it is my pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much.
Well, back at you.
And that was my talk with John Howie Jr. You can keep up with John by following him on Instagram, and that is John Howie Jr., and that's all one word with JR at the end. You can also check out all of his records on Spotify, as well as finding performance clips on YouTube. If you like what you hear on Rulers and Riders, please do me a favor and share the podcast with a friend. Posting a screen cap on Instagram or a link on Facebook helps us spread the word and grow organically. If you have a few minutes, please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. That helps us become more visible and move up in the rankings. Please be sure to follow the show on Instagram. That's rulers_and_riders, as well as the Country Nuggets playlist on Spotify. If you've been following the season of Rulers and Riders since I posted the teaser episode back on February 8th, you'll know that I've been planning to do some new recordings this year. I go into the studio next month with a bunch of great players and I plan to record about a dozen new songs. I'm not sure yet if I'll put the project out as a full length or as a series of singles, but stay tuned here and you'll be the first to hear my new music. Also, be sure to follow my music profile on Instagram, and that is Eric, ERIC, _KINSEY, _official. There you'll find some updates and announcements as my new music comes out. Next week will be Volume 5 of Country Nuggets featuring my favorite country rock mystery band, Jimmy Carter and the Dallas County Green. I'm also toying with the idea of posting some episodes of me doing unscripted takes on musical topics, but I'm still not sure about how that will dovetail with my available time. We will see. That will about do it for this episode of Rulers and Riders. As always, Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you down the road.